Well, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it is for you. In this particular notes session, we are going to discuss topic 2.4, which is ecological tolerance. All right. Keeping in mind that our overarching topic for all of Unit 2 is that ecosystems have structure and diversity that change over time. So when we talk about the term ecological tolerance in this class, we are talking about the range in conditions um, that an organism can tolerate, and that range in conditions is what kind of dictates where we would find that organism and where we would not. So the conditions we're talking about are what we're going to call limiting factors from here on out. So limiting factors are typically referring to abiotic factors like temperature, the amount of precipitation, how much salt's in the water if it's an aquatic ecosystem, the pH of the soil or water, how fast water's flowing, right? Those are things that different organisms have a different amount or different range of tolerance for. And so those types of conditions are some of the things that dictate, where we find uh, uh, rainbow trout versus catfish, and things like that. Okay, so ecological tolerance is that range in conditions that an organism can endure before injury or death results. And that range is different for different organisms. All right, so um, a common way to express the ecological tolerance for an organism is to put our limiting factor on that x-axis. So in the case of the diagram that you're seeing here, the limiting factor is temperature of water. So the particular fish species that we're looking at here has what we call an optimum range, okay, um, of temperature. And that optimum range is defined as the range in temperatures at which we find the majority of our population. Okay, now that's where that organism does best. Now we can go on either end of that optimum range and where we find still some of that organism, but probably far fewer, right? So, and we would call that the zone of physiological stress, right? So there's an optimum range of temperature for this particular fish species. If we go to the higher end of what that species can tolerate, we get to where there's a few organisms that seem to tolerate it just fine from that species, but it's certainly not where that does best, right? And the same thing would happen at the low end of that spectrum. Okay, so we call that the zone of physiological stress. Now, eventually, we're going to get to a temperature on the high end where none of that organism is able to survive. So that would be that zone of intolerance. And likewise on the low end of that spectrum. Okay, so we have the overall ecological tolerance is determined as any level that is tolerable by at least some of that species, right? So the ecological tolerance would extend from this low temperature here to this high temperature here. Okay, so the zone of ecological tolerance has both the optimum range and the physiological stress range included in it. Okay, when we get outside of that range, that's that zone of intolerance outside the ecological tolerance for that species. All right, now let's look at this in comparison because it is sometimes helpful to put multiple organisms on the same graph to kind of see when or if we might see an overlap of niche between those. So what I've put here for us are three really common tree species found over here in the western United States. Depending where you are in terms of latitude and also where you are in terms of climate zones over here. So there's lots of rain shadowing that occurs here in the western United States. If you live on the eastern side of the Sierras or the eastern side of the Cascades, the climate is very different versus the west side. Okay, so let's set up a graph here, an ecological tolerance graph, in which case our y-axis is going to be our abundance of individuals, and our x-axis is going to be precipitation. Now keep in mind, this is just precipitation. There are temperature tolerances that are different for these organisms as well, but we're just going to go purely off of precipitation. So we have precipitation amount, and then our y-axis is going to be abundance. Okay? We're just going to do kind of a relative scale here, so we don't need to put actual numbers on there. All right. So if we compare coastal redwoods to Douglas fir to ponderosa pine, one of the things that should jump out immediately to you is that ponderosa pines seem to do better on the lower end of that precipitation spectrum compared to other western tree species, at least. Okay, so it looks like ponderosa pine can almost tolerate like a semi-desert configuration, but probably does better up around 15 to 20 inches of rain or precipitation per year. So if I was to draw a ecological tolerance curve, so anywhere we're going to go from 12 inches. So let's put our 12 there, for example. All right, that's not working for some reason. There we go, 12. Um, our curve is going to look probably something like this, right? And so we're probably going to have our, right, our most abundance here, but near that 12 range, we're going to have a zone of stress and a zone of stress there, and then below 12, uh, probably a zone of intolerance. Now, ponderosa pines seem to do best in this range. They could probably survive with more than 24 inches of rain per year, but that's not where we tend to find our ponderosa pine forests. They tend to get out competed by other species when that precipitation amount increases, right? So let's take a look at Douglas fir next. So where I grew up in Western Washington, Douglas fir is, at least right around my area, is by far the most common tree type. All right. So Douglas firs have a pretty wide range. Now, they're not going to be found in environments as dry as you might find ponderosa pines, but there is a definite overlap in niche there between Douglas fir and ponderosa pines. So the low end of our Doug fir curve, I'm going to go a different color here just to help illustrate this if I can. So if we put there kind of our six, whoops, excuse me, our 16 point right here, right, all the way up to 120 inches, right? We're going to get this kind of broad range. So this is our ponderosa pines here. This is our Douglas fir here. Okay. Then if we were to put our coastal redwoods on there, notice that the bottom end of our range for coastal redwoods puts us above where we would find, so the bottom range of coastal redwoods is 25, which is above that range for ponderosa pines. So we would expect, if we are looking for trees in different areas, right, that we might find Douglas fir and ponderosa pines together because their niche overlaps there in terms of precipitation amounts. We also might find in the same forest Douglas fir and coastal redwoods because their niche overlaps. What we would not expect to find is in the same forest coastal redwoods and ponderosa pines. Not that it's necessarily impossible for them both to survive in the same climate area. But generally speaking, coastal redwoods prefer warmer, wetter climates. Douglas firs prefer more temperate, wetter climates, right? But can tolerate a lower precipitation amount than coastal redwoods. Ponderosa pines tend to prefer our slightly drier climates. Not so dry that we turn into a semi-arid grassland or a desert, but drier than a lot of our western forests. Okay, now if we were to visit the western United States or go look around at the various forest types, we'd find lots of ponderosa pine forests uh, on the east side of our mountain range, where it tends to be drier. We tend to find our Douglas fir and coastal redwood forests on the western side. Okay, and in fact, if you were to drive from east to west over the Cascade Mountains on Interstate 90, you would see that change. You'd see a pretty steady shift from primarily ponderosa pines on the east side of that pass to a pretty healthy mix of both ponderosa and Douglas fir, and then finally ending in almost entirely uh, Douglas fir over ponderosa pine. Now, there's other trees, of course, in our forests, but we see a lot more abundance of ponderosa pines on the east side where it's drier, a lot higher abundance of Douglas fir on the west side where it's wetter. All right. Now, last thing that we want to bring up with ecological tolerance is that ecological tolerance applies to individuals and species. We kind of just been focusing primarily on the species. But as sort of a segue into the next topic, which is natural disruptions to ecosystems, I think it's worth bringing up, when conditions change to push a certain habitat to one end of that ecological tolerance, right? How might that impact individuals and how might it impact the species as a whole? So let's go back to our graph here. Okay, so let's say, for example, we have corals. So our species of question is coral. All right, so let's say we have a coral reef, right? And let's go temperature again on our x-axis, and of course we have our relative abundance on our y-axis. Uh, so right now, right, let's say that our optimal, so our range for corals looks like this. Right? So we got our optimal zone, and we got zone of stress and zone of stress, and then we got intolerance, intolerance. Okay? So right now, the vast majority of our corals are well adapted to temperatures in this range. Okay, now let's say, for example, that the surface waters heat up for whatever reason due to some climate change. Okay, now what's going to happen as a result of that is as our temperature in the water increases over time, right? What's going to start happening is our corals on the higher end of that zone of stress, all right, those are going to be the ones, the individuals in that species. So remember, we have genetic diversity within a population. Okay, and when that population is genetically diverse, there's going to be some individuals that are better able to tolerate certain conditions than other individuals, even though they're the same species. All right, so we're going to have some corals that tolerate higher temperatures pretty well, and we're going to have some corals that tolerate lower temperatures very well. Now, what's going to happen is if that water heats up, we're going to start selecting against those corals that tolerate the lower end of that spectrum, and we're going to start selecting for those corals that tend to tolerate the higher end of that spectrum. All right. Now, if that temperature change is slow enough, right, we're going to start changing the overall genetic makeup of that coral population. And so over time, if the temperature increases, not too drastically and not too quickly, right, our coral population might shift a little bit to the right on this graph, in which case our new population might do a line like this. That's not very clear, right? In which case, the corals are still corals, but our genetic makeup of our population might shift slightly. And that's called directional selection, by the way, in which case we might have corals that our optimal zone is a different temperature range and our zone of stress might be higher on that spectrum. Okay, now it is worth pointing out that some corals will not be able to tolerate that, and those are selected against. Some corals that are better able to tolerate higher temperatures do survive. If that change in temperature is slow enough, right, the species as a whole might be able to tolerate it because there's enough time for those corals that are able to survive in those higher temperature ranges to reproduce and increase the frequency of that particular gene that allows them to tolerate the higher temperature. Okay, that wraps up our discussion on ecological tolerance. We will talk about natural disruptions, just like that change in temperature, for example, in the next lesson.